Sex, Sex, Murder, and Killer Cupcakes by Allison Janda. Chapter 2. Something felt amiss from the moment I stepped into the food porn studio. The morning had been overcast with a slight chill in the air, the smell of a late, damp autumn whistling through the few festively covered leaves that still clung to their branches. Clutching my coffee cup tightly with both hands, I kept my elbows tightly tucked to my sides, pushing through the throng of morning commuters that clogged the sidewalk. I'd awoken late that day, hastily pulled my hair into a ponytail, scrubbed my face clean, and raced out the door in the yoga clothes I'd been falling asleep. I'd awoken late that day, hastily pulled my hair into a ponytail, scrubbed my face clean, and raced out the door in the yoga clothes I'd fallen asleep in the night before. Not exactly my most professional attire, and certainly not the best smelling, but such lack of care regarding my outward appearance did allow me a much-needed stop through the coffee shop. Also, last night's wares put that day's food porn shoot with pastries from Yummy Tummy only 10 minutes behind schedule. Or so I thought. "Marion!" Addison yelped in surprise as I breezed into the studio, wind-blown flyaways giving me a somewhat Medusa-like quality. "Didn't you get my voicemail?" She paused. "Darling, we canceled. I was getting ready to head to the journal." Numbed by the cold and not yet fully alert from caffeine, I paused, processing her words one at a time. After a few seconds, I dug through my coat pockets for my phone, which, coincidentally, was dead, having never been plugged in the night before. "Perfect," I groused under my breath. "Alec never showed up to makeup this morning, and I didn't have the time to drum up a replacement," she informed me. "We'll have to have Betsy reschedule things." As if on cue, Betsy, our short, adorable, freckle-nosed intern, scuttled into the studio, gripping her neon clipboard and speaking frantically into her headset. Her free hand pushed her silver wire frames back up her nose, but they kept sliding back down with every nod of her head. "Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm, mm." "Okay, thank you," she said, clicking off and raising her gaze to meet ours. "Alec's roommate in Tampa." "Alec's roommate is in Tampa. He hasn't heard from Alec in a few days." "Damn it," Addison murmured under her breath. Unconsciously, I caught the twitch that plagued her left eye when she's exponentially pissed off. Betsy swallowed hard, noticing the same, and her sweet brown eyes widened to the size of saucers. Addison had a famously short fuse. Upon reaching her breaking point, there was a nearly undetectable twitch of her left eye before she became a flailing, ferocious, red-faced string of cuss words, the tirade falling upon whoever stood closest. Slowly, I took a half step backward. Surprisingly, however, Addison sucked in a deep breath, noisily releasing it as she closed her eyes. Shrugging her arms into the fall jacket she'd been clutching, she cinched the sash tightly around her waist and shuddered like a dog shaking off water. This was new for Addison, and infinitely more disturbing. At least with cuss words, I knew where we all stood. Plus, she returned to normal afterward, like saying the F word 3 times in a single sentence was a complete physical release. Cutting my gaze back to Betsy, she too seemed ill at ease with this more mindful version of Addison. Betsy stood rigid, her clipboard clutched to her chest in a meager attempt at protection, eyes half closed, her short red bob offsetting her scrunched face, which had gone entirely devoid of color. The cold concrete studio was silent, save for the echoes of Addison's deep breathing exercise. Slowly, Betsy turned to me, her dark eyes troubled. I shrugged and shook my head. After a few more uncomfortable moments, Addison turned and began walking purposefully toward the stairs that led to our joint office. The clicking of her heels paused, the door clicked shut, and Betsy and I were once again enveloped in echoing silence. We both released the breaths neither of us realized we'd been holding in a loud whoosh. Taking a long swig of my strong coffee, I watched Betsy disappear without a word around the corner, likely curling into the safety of her cubicle. With slightly more bravado than I actually felt, I marched towards the stairs and up to the office, ignoring the fact that my squeaky sneakers made me feel like a youth headed to the principal's office after a failed attempt at rebellion. Taking a deep breath, I knocked a little too hard on the door and let myself in without invitation. Being Addison's best friend, I enjoyed the luxury of shoving my way into her life at times she would have yelled or cussed out others. Her head was in her hands, elbows akimbo on her beautiful mahogany desk, blonde hair spilling in front of her ears. Her thin shoulders shook with the efforts produced by what sounded a lot like what I can only describe as Lamaze breathing. Clicking the door closed behind me, I cleared my throat to announce my presence and waited for her to speak. A few seconds later, the deep breathing paused. My therapist said he wanted to recommend me to some anger management classes, Addison confessed between her hands. So you punched him? Addison lifted her head and smiled, then thoughtfully began twirling a long strand of platinum hair around her index finger. He told me that I needed to learn how to manage my frustration properly. Wrinkling my nose in disbelief, I asked as nonchalantly as possible, and you're going to do that by mentally working through anger as if it were the physical pain of childbirth? Grinning at each other, we simultaneously burst into giggles. Seconds later, her face crumpled and fell back into her hands. What are we going to do about Alec? She moaned. This is the third time in 2 months he hasn't called and hasn't shown up to a shoot. It's probably another hangover. We fire him, I replied simply. But he's gorgeous. Our best-looking male model, Addison stammered. And that's saying something considering everyone who models for us has to look good naked. He doesn't even get paid. He gets exposure, I reminded her, and a lot of images for his portfolio. Yummy Tummy paid well above what was necessary in order to be featured exclusively in this next edition. Addison sighed and spun around to face her window, which was 1 story above street level. The trees outside covered the cloudy morning. You could almost be fooled into thinking that it was a semi-warm autumn day if people weren't holding fast to their hoods and scarves as they pushed hard against the wind. We're going to have to find somebody new. Can you ask Rory to throw together an open call? I'm sure he'd love to hear it from you, I smiled. She snapped herself around to look at me so quickly I thought she'd fall out of her chair. Stifling a laugh, I opened the door to our joint office and let myself out. Despite Addison's on-again, off-again relationship with a model she'd met who worked for us during our humble beginnings, Rory, who did design for food porn, was madly in love with her. He refused to give up hope that one day she'd succumb to his adoration. On the outside, our building was a boring tiny warehouse with 4 single square windows per side. It was situated on a quiet spot on Water Street, away from the downtown hype. The main entrance consisted of 2 giant metal doors, which sustained heavy spray paint from young budding artists. Well, vandals, if you asked Addison or Rory. Once inside our building, you were enveloped in a soft gray and white, albeit cold, concrete studio. Backgrounds of every imagination hung from the ceiling on large black frames that could be flipped through like posters. Various lighting equipment was tucked into the cracks and crevices. A small pile of rugs and mats haphazardly took up a small corner by the door. About 15 feet away was a sturdy black metal staircase, which led to one office with a door that closed, the one belonging to Addison and myself, and a dressing room. Around the corner of the staircase was a tiny administration office painted a blue as brilliant as the sky just before it tinges orange with sunset. It was home to 4 paltry cubicles, 2 of which sat empty, each featuring a different theme based off our well-known magazine covers. My favorite was the intern cube featuring People magazine's Sexiest Man Alive from a few years ago. He'd agreed to advertise Bootastic chocolate milk and had needed an entire carton to cover his, well, anyway. When we were close to a deadline, the room, though small, hummed with energy from its 2 occupants. There were also a lot of swear words. On days like today, however, 1 week after our release, the room was quiet. Draping my coat over a wobbly stool in the corner, I set my coffee on a workbench and turned towards the cubes to scan for Rory. He's easy to spot, sporting a mop of thick sandy curls atop his 6'4" frame. While his suit coats never fit quite right and his glasses look like he pulled them straight from an 80s sitcom, he's of incredibly well-collected mind and vastly ahead on the creative curve. We can afford to pay him a pathetic sum compared to the amount of work he produces for us, but he inherited a ridiculous fortune from some great something or other and genuinely enjoys working in our humble space. No doubt you've seen his work in our publication. His layouts are award-winning. As if I'd conjured him, a small metal door off the alleyway opened, and Rory barreled in, nose tucked deep in his fully zipped non-name brand fleece. You'd never know the guy could buy the country of Sweden simply by checking out his wardrobe. Out of breath and red-faced from the wind, he set his briefcase by the door and slowly removed his jacket. "Hey, kid, what's cookin'?" he asked me candidly in his British accent. Out of breath and red-faced from the wind, he set his briefcase by the door and slowly removed his jacket. "Hey, kid, what's cookin'?" he asked me candidly in his British accent once he noticed my presence. Rory calls everyone kid, even though we all, save for Betsy, are in our very late 20s. He once told me that he picked up the phrase from an American film and liked it so much he decided to use it. "That," I said, pointing to his brown and battered briefcase, "is foul and unnecessary." Rory smiled, bemused, and began walking toward his cubicle. Following behind, I asked, "Do you have time to throw together an open call for male models?" His brow wrinkled in confusion, and I could almost see his brain working through my words. "Didn't we just put one of those on this past spring?" he asked, hanging his coat from the old-fashioned standing coat rack he'd furnished the space with. Shifting my gaze to the gray factory order carpet, which had suddenly become incredibly interesting, I heaved a sigh and kicked at something invisible on the ground in response. "Well, that's too bad," Rory mused. "Betsy's always telling me Alec is what's the term? Hottie with a botty, that's it." "Rory," I reprimanded. "I'm not the one saying it," he protested. Besides, I certainly didn't think he seemed as if he'd be a reliable candidate. But I was overruled. Giving me a pointed look, he sat down and swiveled toward his computer. I had to give him that one. The female staff members tended to get the final word on the male models. Addison, Betsy, and I would take turns choosing, as we each have drastically different tastes in men. As his computer slowly clicked and whirred to life, he sighed. "I'll get something together by noon. Are you going to be around? Should I forward it to you?" Addison. His back straightened considerably when I said her name, and he combed his fingers rapidly through his mess of curls. "Where? Is she here?" "No, I meant forward the release to Addison," I corrected. His shoulders drooped and his hands fell back to his sides. My heart ached for him. "She said to tell you hi," I lied, immediately feeling like a traitor. Still, this news seemed to perk Rory up a bit, and I slowly backed out of his cubicle, turning toward the development room. Our photo development room, also known as my second office, was only accessible through the room with the cubicles. It's a windowless sanctuary, a former warehouse storage area. I've charmed up my walls with various stills from my past several years. Small boxes of photos spill onto the workbenches and across my desk, which is actually just 3 sawhorses glued together. It was here where I could forget the false hope I'd just fed sweet Rory, the one where he fantasized that the model, as I referred to Peter, Addison's on-again, off-again boyfriend, would soon break her heart, leaving her open for an intimate office romance. The only trouble with working in a windowless office is that you're always unsure of the time. Stretching my arms high above my head, I took note of my growling stomach and decided I was in desperate need of a snack. No sooner had I put some developed film away than there was a frantic, loud knock on the door. Everyone knows better than to open it. Tripping over a bin overflowing with prints on my way to answer it, I skipped the last few steps, opening the door with an annoyed, "What?" Betsy stood wide-eyed and frantic on the other side. She was practicing that look a lot today. Addison said she needs to speak with you right away. It's an emergency. She's still here, I grumbled hungrily, trailing after Betsy. I thought she was headed to her grown-up job. Upstairs, the door to the dressing room was slightly cracked, and a light was on. Perhaps Alec had shown up after all. Maybe the emergency was that the photo shoot could begin. Opening the door to her office, I noticed that Addison wasn't at her desk. A loud sniffle shifted my gaze in the opposite direction, where I took stock of my much disheveled partner sitting on our couch, covered in a lapful of wet tissues. There was a pile of tissues gathered in a corner of our otherwise fingerprint-free and flawless conference table. Betsy darted around me and stood beside Addison, clutching a cell phone and looking incredibly uncomfortable. Upon seeing me, Addison's chin began to tremble. "I've been texting you," she howled, melting into a mass of tears and snot. Closing the door behind me, I gave Betsy a worry look before easing closer to Addie's side. I hadn't seen her have this colossal of a meltdown since Johnny Depp bowed out of a photo shoot due to last-minute scheduling conflicts 2 years ago, and nothing that had happened thus far today had suggested that this version of her would be waiting for me shortly before the lunch hour. No wonder Betsy had looked so agitated. "It's bad," Addison gasped, blowing her nose loudly. Fear clutched my heart as I waited for her to continue. Was it her parents? My parents? Peter? Sure, her boyfriend was a nitwit, but I didn't wish ill on the man. Well, maybe sometimes, but now I'd feel bad. "What happened?" I whispered, placing a hand on her lap and bracing myself for the worst. Betsy shuffled in close beside me. Sniffling, Addison raised her eyes to meet mine. "Alec's dead." There was a beat of empty disbelief, followed by my loud, nervous laughter. "What?" I asked, positive I hadn't heard it right. "He's dead?" Addison nodded, and I turned to Betsy, positive that I was being punked. After all, Alec was all of 22. But Betsy's face was devoid of humor and chilled me straight to my core. They weren't joking. "How do you know?" I asked, suddenly serious. A look passed between the two women that I couldn't quite read. Addison began to weep again, softly, and Betsy motioned me out of the room. Out on the landing, she turned to me. "Addison wouldn't let me call the police until you were here to tell us what to do." Nothing was making sense, yet my brain was slowly piecing everything together, sending adrenaline coursing through my veins. Holding fast to the rail, I followed Betsy to the dressing room. Still clutching her cell phone, Betsy used it to gently push the door open a little wider. And there, slumped over in one of the hard plastic chairs, was a very gray, very lifeless Alec.